So when we talked about the Camp David Accords the other day, that is the absolute last stuff that the International Baccalaureate will be asking you guys about on paper 1. Okay, Camp David Accords is where it ends. Everything else is fair game from 1945 up to 1979-80 when the Camp David Accords are ultimately signed. I want to just give you a quick run through of the last 30 years of the Arab-Israeli story, because the Camp David Accords gives you a little bit of like positivity at the end of this Arab-Israeli conflict story that we've discussed to this point. Remember, Egypt and Israel were, like, I guess we could say, the two arch nemeses of each other throughout the duration of our study. In 48, they fought. In 56, we've got the Suez Crisis. We've got Nasser arming Fedayeen infiltrations across the border. We've got the Six-Day War in 1967. We've got the War of Attrition in the interwar years. We've got the 1973 October War. And then finally, the Camp David Accords solves all those problems, right? Egypt gets back the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt recognizes Israel. Israel gets that recognition. Israel gets to go through the Suez Canal again. And it's all kind of tied up neatly in this little bow that says everything is going to be all right. But then we closed the other day with talking about how Anwar Sadat's going to be assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Anwar Sadat's going to be assassinated. How the United States' focus begins to leave the Arab-Israeli conflict story and goes into other areas, not only in the Middle East, more focus on Iran, support for Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war, concern about the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, a new focus on Cold War tensions. And while all that's going down, we still have issues in the Arab world between Israel and their Arab neighbors, and Israel more prominently, and the Palestinians. So let's do a quick run through of like the last 30 years of history and everything that is impacting the story, the continued story of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So in 1982, and we've got a picture here of some explosions in Beirut, Lebanon. In 1982, Israel will invade the nation of Lebanon. Lebanon is that small nation to the north of Israel. If you guys recall, when we talked about Black September, in the early 1970s, when the Palestinian Liberation Organization saw the need to have a state ally, and they're based in Jordan. They saw a need to have a state ally, and the king of Jordan, King Hussein, was certainly not going to be that guy. And so they turned their attention to ousting him, or to assassinating him. And the king of Jordan then turned his army against the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Jordan. The PLO would be driven out of Jordan, and they would ultimately take up refuge in southern Lebanon. Well, in response to PLO attacks across that northern border of Israel, Israel will invade the nation of Lebanon in 1982. Now, this invasion of southern Lebanon is going to obviously create a lot of conflict and chaos in Lebanon. It's going to support the continued growth of an organization in southern Lebanon called Hezbollah. Hezbollah is an organization that we need to make mention of because they're going to be continually important to the story. Hezbollah is a socio-paramilitary organization in southern Lebanon. Like, what do I mean by that? They are a militant paramilitary organization. When I say paramilitary, para means like kind of outside of, like if you have a paramedic come to you, right? They're like coming to your house to take care of you. Paramilitary is outside of the traditional military. All right? So Hezbollah has a paramilitary wing. They have an armed wing to it. But then they also are providing a social safety network for the community. Hezbollah has sponsored the construction of schools and the building of clinics and food banks and other things like this in southern Lebanon. And they have grown in southern Lebanon as the Lebanese government has had trouble maintaining control over its own territory and as issues with Israel have intensified. Hezbollah is a Shiite organization. Okay, it's made up of Shiite Muslims. The PLO and Palestinians themselves are primarily Sunni Muslims. All right? Hezbollah is Shiite Muslim. Hezbollah also gets a lot of funding from the nation of Iran, the largest Shiite nation on the planet. And all of this story is happening at the exact same time that Iran goes from becoming Iran friendly with the United States to the Iranian Revolution, Iran being the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so Iran supports Hezbollah and gives them funding and arms them, on one hand, to help them strike against Israel and wage this fight against the Israeli state, but also to stick it to the Americans, all right, because the United States obviously is supportive of the Israeli nation. So this incursion into Lebanon, while it does push back the Palestinian threat from Lebanon, it also emboldens this group Hezbollah, and they're going to be important to the story going forward. Israel will remain in Lebanon, or most of in Lebanon through 1985, where they mostly withdraw, but they will maintain a security force along the border of Israel and Lebanon, and that remains until the year 2000. So now we can say, for at least up until the year 2000, Israel is not only occupying the West Bank and Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights, but they're also occupying a little strip of land in southern Lebanon. Israel's justification, of course, is for its own security. They say, we need to occupy these lands, otherwise we keep getting attacked. Fast forward a little bit here to 1987. Now, the Palestinian Liberation Organization does not have a state ally anymore, right? Jordan doesn't support them. Egypt, of course, has now recognized Israel. The PLO sees itself largely on its own. And as settlement construction by Israel continues into 1987, remember, Israel, since they took over the occupied territories after the Six-Day War in 1967, has been constructing settlements in Gaza, settlements in the West Bank. These are Jewish communities being guarded by the Israeli Defense Forces within Palestinian territories. As the settlement construction has continued, and as the Palestinians are getting less and less support from other nations, in 1987, the Palestinians, supported by the PLO, launched what is known as the Intifada. The Intifada. I-N-T-I-F-A-D-A. This is an uprising, a largely organic uprising, a grassroots uprising of Palestinians in the streets of Gaza and in the streets of the West Bank, trying to push off or shake off. The word intifada is derived from the Arabic word for to shake off, the Israeli occupation. During this intifada, we see an upswing of attacks from Palestinians against Israeli defense forces and retribution for those attacks from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, against the Palestinians. And it becomes a propaganda weapon for the Palestinians. Because you see in the Intifada, you see the Israeli Defense Forces, one of the most advanced militaries in the world, facing off against teenage Palestinians or young Palestinians who in many cases are armed with only rocks, or in fact the stone, the rock, becomes the symbol of the Intifada. We have the stone, they have the army. Take your pictures of us, world. And then the world gets to see what becomes a David versus Goliath story with roles reversed. Remember, in the biblical David versus Goliath, David was the Jew, right? Well, now Goliath is the Israeli Defense Forces. And this is used as a propaganda weapon for the world to try to garner sympathy for the Palestinians. Because if some Israeli soldier gets clocked in the head with a rock, it happens. And he returns fire, purposefully or accidentally or whatever. And a young Palestinian boy is killed. This is a tremendous propaganda weapon for the Palestinians. It makes Israel look bad. All right? At the same time, in 1987, as this Intifada begins, we have the birth of another organization called Hamas. Got them written down here. And here's a young follower of Hamas in Gaza. Hamas has its sponsorship, or has its support, it grows out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a group we've already mentioned, out of Egypt. And Hamas is born in Gaza, right? It used to be a part of Egypt, right? Hamas is connected with the Muslim Brotherhood. Their goal is twofold: to end the Israeli state and create a Palestinian state, but their goal is also religiously motivated. Hamas is a Islamist organization that wants to establish an Islamic state for Palestinians based on Islamic Sharia law, or at least their interpretation of Sharia law. This is an important turn in the story, all right? Because we've got the PLO that's long been there. And if you guys recall, we talked about the PLO was actually organized by Nasser, because he wanted to control all of the Palestinian guerrilla movements. Prior to the beginning of the PLO, there was a group called Fatah. Fatah was a Palestinian organization attempting to organize itself, those guerrilla movements. And a guy named Yasser Arafat was the leader of the Fatah movement. By the late 60s, Fatah will be absorbed into the PLO. But the PLO is like secular. The PLO doesn't have a religious affiliation, even though most of the PLO are Muslims. There's Palestinians that are Christians, okay? And many Christian Palestinians were supporters of the PLO. Hamas, however, is strictly Islamist. All right, Hamas wants this Palestinian movement to be driven not only as a political movement to retake this territory, but also as a religious movement. And I think you guys can now see the PLO and Hamas, they're not going to see eye to eye on everything in this situation. All right? So now the PLO and Hamas have a division. As time presses on, we see some agreements worked out between the PLO and Israel. This is a photo of the signing of the 1993 Oslo Accords. A series of agreements worked out between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. This is Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. This is the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. This is an American president, Bill Clinton, who helped negotiate these agreements. In 1993, the Oslo Accords are signed. And Yasser Arafat, leader of the PLO, will for the first time recognize Israel's right to exist. In return for that recognition, Yitzhak Rabin and the State of Israel will offer limited Palestinian self-rule in the territories. Hey, you recognize our existence? You guys can start governing yourselves in the territories. We will start to backtrack on the occupation. You can begin to govern yourself. It's not creating a Palestinian state yet, but it's like that first step towards getting there. And they shake hands, they sign the agreement. Bill Clinton is so proud of himself for what he's done. And this gives us hope that we might be working towards better times. Unfortunately, and this has a lot of parallels to the Camp David story. Do you guys recall? Anwar Sadat signs the Camp David Accords. And then 2 years later, Anwar Sadat is assassinated by radical Egyptians who don't want a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. In 1995, Yitzhak Rabin, prime minister that signed the Oslo Accords, which started to give up some control of the occupied territories. Yitzhak Rabin will be assassinated by a radical right-wing Israeli who did not want to see agreements like this go forward with the Palestinians. Yes? Rabin, R-A-B-I-N. Yitzhak, Y-I-T-Z-A-K, Rabin, R-A-B-I-N. I will never forget that in 1995 when this went down, because it was on a Saturday afternoon in the fall, and the University of Michigan football team, of which I was a student at, was playing Michigan State University, and this was the game of the catch when Charles Woodson made that crazy sideline one-armed catch interception, and it was awesome. And I was a young, stupid college kid who only cared about the Michigan State game, and then the broadcast of the game stopped, because Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. And idiot me was like, what the heck? Football game, I don't care about this. And now I look back and I recognize what an idiot I once was, because how big this was. And how difficult we can see that coming to a lasting peace is, as long as there are radicals on either side of the story here. All right, fast forward to the year 2000. Further attempts at agreements between Israel and the Palestinians are going to be made. An Israeli prime minister, a guy named Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat have new meetings that ultimately get derailed. Upwards of 95% of the West Bank was agreed to by Ehud Barak to give up to the Palestinians for a Palestinian state. But it wasn't all of it. And the biggest sticking point is East Jerusalem, where the old city is, where the Temple Mount is. That became the biggest sticking point in these negotiations. But so close to signing a what could have been a lasting agreement. And in the midst of these negotiations, a guy named Ariel Sharon, a right-wing leader of the Likud party in Israel, and we've already mentioned this Likud party. They're the guys that really want to hold on to as much as they can. He makes a prominent march to the Temple Mount in the old city of Jerusalem, escorted by 1,000 Israeli policemen. So he's got an armed escort. And he goes to the Temple Mount and he gives a speech. And this concerns the Palestinians in the community, that it looks like a takeover of the Temple Mount. It looks like a takeover of that land. Because what is atop of the Temple Mount? For Jews, it is the Al-Aqsa Mount. What is atop of it? It's called the Temple Mount for Jews. What's atop of it? The Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, right? Where thousands of Muslims are free to go and pray, and it makes it look like an Israeli takeover of that area. And so a protest will begin. And the protest becomes violent. People throwing rocks, people throwing Molotov cocktails, the Israeli police cracking down. And what comes out of this is known as the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada is far more violent, far more deadly for both Israelis and Palestinians, especially Palestinians, than the First Intifada was. The Second Intifada is marked by the rise of the suicide attacks, where Palestinians armed with explosives will board Israeli buses, or will detonate themselves within Israeli supermarkets or nightclubs, and the Israeli retribution for these attacks will be swift and harsh. All right? I want to make a note. Now that we have Hamas on the scene, we have this organization that now has at its core a religious idea, right? That it is leading its followers to believe that fighting and dying in the name of regaining this territory for Islam is something that would be smiled upon by God. And that is going to lead to the encouragement of suicide bombing as a viable weapon in this war. So the Second Intifada is a disaster within the Arab-Israeli conflict. All the while, here's a photo from the Second Intifada. All the while, there are attempts at further negotiations. With the rise of the violence in the Second Intifada, Israel begins to construct the wall in the West Bank and in Gaza. Israel begins to construct a wall. The wall begins to be constructed, and this is the problem, and I think this is something that Donald Trump needs to think about. Okay, you're going to talk about building a wall. Where do you put the wall? Does it go like right on the border? Well, of course, we can't put a wall between us and Mexico right on the border, because what's right on the border between us and Mexico? There's a river, right? It's like a Rio Grande River. You can't easily build a wall in the middle of a river. So where do you put the wall? Well, of course, the United States, if we were going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it, that wall is going to have to be on the American side of the border. So like every inch of ground between the Rio Grande and the American side of that border is now going to be like this weird, unusable no man's land, right? Well, Israel, when they're going to build a wall, where do you think they build it? Right along the border of the 1967 line? Nah, they're going to build it on the Palestinian side of that wall, of that border. So they can wrap into Israel some Jewish settlements that had been constructed. Ultimately, it's seen as another land grab by the nation of Israel. In 2004, Yasser Arafat dies. And this man, not that man, this man, Mahmoud Abbas, A-B-B-A-S, becomes the leader of the PLO. The United States likes this guy. We think he's someone that can be worked with. In the same year, Israel launches strikes against the founder of Hamas, guy the last name of Yassin, and they kill him. And then they assassinate his successor, the new leader of Hamas, in Gaza. And we continue to see tension, especially within Gaza and from the group Hamas against Israel. In 2005, amidst thousands of rockets being fired from the Gaza Strip into Israel. Now, when I say rockets, we got to be very careful. This is not like your model rocket that you would buy at the rocketry store, the model shop, and you would launch in a field. These are like small missiles, okay? But they're also not leveling homes. If they land in your backyard, you're going to have a really bad day. If they hit your house, you've got some repair work to do. But very few of these rockets are causing great harm or certainly death to a lot of Israelis. But, yes, sir?
Well, part of that is because of the Iron Dome.
The Israeli, yeah, which wasn't as advanced in the earlier years. But, yeah, Israel does work to shoot on loud. My point is, these rockets aren't bringing a great death and destruction to Israel. But it is a constant threat and a nuisance, certainly, to the Israeli state. In 2005, Israel agrees to a ceasefire with the Palestinians and in Gaza and in the West Bank, and they agree to withdraw or evacuate 15,000 Israeli settlers from Gaza. Hamas, however, agrees to nothing because Hamas doesn't recognize the existence of the State of Israel. And Hamas will continue their rocket fire into the State of Israel. This is responded to by Israeli airstrikes into Gaza. And here you can see some of the results from Israeli airstrikes into Gaza. The Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated pieces of land on the planet. So when Israel responds with airstrikes in Gaza, absolutely you're going to see the death and the injury of innocent civilians. In 2006, let's talk about this first. In 2006, Hamas will defeat Fatah, which was the main body within the PLO, in a Palestinian parliamentary election. So the majority of Palestinians begin to support Hamas in their leadership rather than Fatah in their leadership. Yes?
So then that means that PLO now has kind of like a religious affiliation?
A little bit, yes.
So what was the reason why Hamas beat PLO?
Because they have better propaganda, more Palestinians are frustrated with the continued occupation, don't want to see any negotiation, want to see actually the continued fighting with Israel. So in 2006, Hamas defeats Fatah in parliamentary elections. And from this, we see a conflict arise between Hamas and Fatah. And this will be an armed conflict, with Hamas and Fatah fighting against each other for ultimately control of the Palestinian Authority. Yes?
Okay, so these are both part of the PLO?
They're both part of the Palestinian world. Okay? They're both part of the Palestinian world. Fatah is a part of the PLO. Hamas was this organic offshoot with connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. But now they're in a conflict with each other. Because these guys who had been there since the beginning, right, fighting against Israel, have now begun to work on, hey, let's work out deals with Israel. Maybe we can start to work on some agreements with Israel. We recognize Israel. Fatah recognizes Israel. Hamas has refused to do that, all right? This is also a secular organization, whereas this is deeply religious. The two factions will divide. Yes, ma'am?
So
there is really no, well, yes. The PLO recognized itself, and the United Nations recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative body of the Palestinians. All right? But then Hamas was born long after. Hamas comes on the scene afterwards. But as many Palestinians began to support Hamas, when they have, the PLO now is a legitimate political organization, they have elections, Hamas candidates began to win these elections. And by 2006, Hamas is now controlling a majority of those parliamentary seats. The two factions divide power, with Fatah controlling the West Bank and Hamas controlling Gaza. All right? That is largely still what's happening today, with Fatah in control of the West Bank and Hamas in control of Gaza. While this is all happening in 2006, Israel, in response to a Hezbollah border crossing where some Israeli border guards were taken captive, Israel will launch a war against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. This war is hugely violent and destructive to the Lebanese nation, and it ultimately ends with no resolution except for Hezbollah getting even more support out of the Iranian regime. In 2007, continuing conflict within the Palestinian community between Hamas and Fatah result in a divide. Now with Fatah controlling the West Bank and Hamas controlling Gaza, I've already mentioned that. And Hamas will continue to support rocket fire into Israel as they smuggle weapons in largely across the border from Egypt. Israel in 2008 will launch two major operations into the Gaza Strip. And this is a disaster for people living within the densely populated Gaza region. As we fast forward to today, the story is largely the same. A divided Palestinian world between Fatah in the West Bank and Gaza and Hamas in Gaza, and Israel still leading an occupation of these areas, even though they do have limited self-rule. And occasionally, violence coming across the border into Israel, whether it be rocket fire or other attacks. And Israel responding very harshly when these attacks come. All right? So the story really gets no better, and it brings us to